What is up, Karma Nation? Welcome into another edition of MLB DFS Live. I am your host and the only one on this podcast, Bales. Ben is currently out for a bachelor party, but I wanted to get something out for you guys because we have a nice 14-game slate with a lot of different ways to go. So essentially, it's going to be the same podcast that we do, outlining pitchers, stacks. I'll go through position by position, just outline some of my favorite plays. But it's just going to be me talking this entire time. We do have, or I guess I do have the questions pulled up. So feel free to ask anything you want, and I can just answer any questions. I see that Chris said that he won $1,500 yesterday with the awesome article that I wrote. Absolutely love to hear that. Before we get started, our content is up on dfskarma.com. You can find my MLB breakdown. That's the article I wrote yesterday. I wrote the game theory one. But the MLB breakdown is on the website at the moment. That's also where you can get our subscriptions to MLB props. Basically anything that's going on, you can find a subscription for it. We do have day passes, weekly, monthly. They're all varying price tags. So head over to dfskarma.com, pick one of those up as we continue through the baseball season. But to get started on tonight, pitcher is interesting, to say the least. I feel there's a lot of different ways that you can go. I don't think there's one set way. I would guess right now, if you're spending up at pitcher, it seems like Lance Lynn in a matchup against the Detroit Tigers is probably going to get the most ownership. In cash games, I probably slightly favor Max Scherzer. I just believe that he's a better pitcher, and I generally don't get too worried about his matchups. I think the kind of weird thing is that he's entering this game as an underdog against Urias. Still, it's set at only 8 runs. We know that Scherzer essentially just struggles with home runs. The Dodgers probably take him deep at some point in this game. I have no issues with that. He's going to rack up strikeouts that Lance Lynn generally can't. Lynn is also significantly less consistent on the road. And don't get me wrong, I don't like Detroit's offense. I just also don't necessarily love Lance Lynn on the road. So it's at the point where if I'm paying up for a pitcher tonight in cash, I do favor Scherzer. I think if I'm spending $9,000 or more in tournaments, Scherzer would be my number one guy, followed by probably Lance Lynn and then Julio Urias right behind them. I do believe that Lance McCullers is fine. I just prefer Lynn and Urias above him, so I don't necessarily see why I would pay the $9,400 for him. As you drop down a bit more, I guess I'll just break this down into tiers because that'll probably be easiest. Between $8,000 and $9,000, there's some options here that I do think are relatively fine. In cash, the obvious option is going to be Adrian Houser. He is a legitimately good pitcher that tends to be underpriced. He just struggles a bit with strikeouts. I don't really care that much at 8,300. He doesn't need 10 strikeouts to hit value or anything. He's the favorite against the Pittsburgh Pirates. Slight, but still a favorite, and the game's only set at 7.5 runs. So I do like Adrian Houser more or less in terms of cash games. I think I would probably pivot off of him in tournaments. And I don't necessarily think that that's where I would go. I would probably dip below 8,000 for my SP2 in cash. Other options in the 8 to 9K range, I do think that Zach Gallen's very interesting. I just think that he's a really good pitcher. I don't love attacking the San Francisco Giants offense, but I don't really care when you have a high-end pitcher that's priced at 8,800. I think that Alex Wood and Frankie Montas are fine, but I'm not bending over backwards to get either of them, and I probably would just prefer to play Adrian Houser instead. And then I do think when you drop below 8,000, there are multiple options that make a lot of sense. The cash play, I believe, in terms of ownership, will likely be JT Brubaker. He's, again, a legitimately good pitcher that's been mispriced the entire season. He's only $7,000, gets a matchup against a strikeout-happy Milwaukee Brewers team. I mean, it's hard not to play him in cash games. I think that at the moment, if you asked me who I would go in cash, it would probably be Scherzer, Brubaker. I'm a big fan of Kyle Gibson too, though. I think that he's a legitimately good pitcher that's way underpriced. If you haven't noticed, we have multiple pitchers that have more or less been underpriced for the majority of the season. Um, we can kind of take advantage of it. And some are going to be relatively low owned just because of the way that this slate's going to break down. Gibson gets a matchup against the Seattle Mariners. We know that they have a bad offense. The problem is they have been heating up a little bit in recent days. So it's tough to fully get behind him, but I do think that he's actually good. And I'm not really scared off by the Mariners' offense. Outside of them, one of my favorite pitchers that I use in tournaments just because he's due for so much positive regression is Eduardo Rodriguez. We know that when he's on, he has the skills of more or less a 10K pitcher. He's at 7,400. I don't love a matchup against Oakland. I'm also not going to shy away from it. The strikeout upside is there. And when you look at all of his advanced metrics, it's just way too cheap for him. So I think that him and Sonny Gray at $100 more, very good options. I actually don't think it's a bad idea whatsoever to go with both of them in tournaments, and then you can basically pay up for any bats that you want. Outside of that, I mean, I think you can take a shot on like Drew Smyly just because the Marlins are bad against left-handed pitching, but I don't necessarily think you have to go down to anything ridiculous. So that's probably where I'm sitting with Brubaker being the cheapest option that I would use. And I do think that he becomes relatively chalky tonight. Eduardo Rodriguez, Sonny Gray, Kyle Gibson, all under 8K, all make really good options. And then if you're paying up, it's more or less between Scherzer and Lance Lynn, I think, for me. But I do believe that Julio Urias can kind of sit in a tier with Lance Lynn, especially in tournaments, not in cash. Moving to stacks, there are a lot that I like. Most of them are sitting up top. The problem with that type of thing in terms of ownership is that specific stacks are going to get more ownership. So a lot of people don't play the highest implied totals just because they don't or they do expect them to garner ownership. That can't be the case when there's like 6 or 7 teams with a implied run total over 5. Not all of them can garner ownership, and if they all do, then most likely all of them are going to be too low owned anyway. I believe the chalk stack is most likely the St. Louis Cardinals. They still have some guys that are just way too cheap. I think that the Colorado Rockies also make sense up there, and you can just basically full out stack the Coors game because it's not going to be difficult, just the way the pricing came out. My favorite stack of the slate, I believe, is probably the Houston Astros. The only thing that I am relatively worried about is that the Cleveland bullpen has been really good in recent, I guess like the last 30 days, actually. They've been one of the best bullpens in the MLB. So when you get Henches out there, obviously I think he's going to give up some home runs, especially if he throws 3-4 innings. Just the way that the Houston lineup is, they have too much power. But then you're going to get a decent amount against the Cleveland bullpen, which is actually really good. So you kind of need them to dominate Henches early and then hope that they bring in some of their worst relievers just based on the fact that Lance McCullers is going to stop their offense, which I do believe is 100% in the realm of possibilities. I also really, really like Kansas City. If we're just talking games outside of Coors, I think that the Royals are a really good stack. I don't think that J.A. Happ is good whatsoever. Happ has given up a lot of home runs this year. He's just given up a lot of hard contact, and he's kind of well past his prime at this point. So I feel like in cash, you're probably leaning Colorado, St. Louis, just more or less stacking that game because it's not difficult. In tournaments, my top 2 would probably be Houston and Kansas City. Other stacks that I would be 100% comfortable playing would be the Angels, the Reds. I think actually the Tampa Bay Rays are relatively interesting against Manoah. He has struggled with home runs. I do believe he will be a good pitcher at some point in time. It's just early in his career, he's really struggled with home runs. And when that's the case, it's always a fine option to stack against them. And on the other side, if you want to play Toronto as well, I have no problems really whatsoever with that. But Those are more or less the stacks that I'm looking at. I think if you want to get weird with like Atlanta with Pablo Lopez on the road, I don't really have too many issues with that. The White Sox against Casey Mize and hope that he blows up a little bit. I don't have too many issues there. My big thing is that with all these stacks that really stick out, you're just kind of taking a shot on someone. If you go with like the White Sox or the Braves, which, obviously can work out on any given slate, but it's just not what I like to do. I generally like to attack some of the higher implied totals that just aren't going to get the ownership that they should. We can move to position by position. Starting at catcher, I think the obvious option is Yadier Molina. He's hitting fifth. He's mid fours. Just the matchup against Chichi Gonzalez. It's very clear that it's not going to be difficult to get him into your lineups. Outside of him, I think a direct pivot of Max Stassi does make a lot of sense. I really like him if you're spending up Salvador Perez or even like Gary Sanchez. I don't like Sanchez's matchup against Taijuan Walker. I would much prefer Perez, but both of them are fine. Elias Diaz at 3,800, I do believe makes sense just because you're getting a cheap piece of the Colorado game, which is always a good thing. In terms of punts, I don't necessarily think there's anyone that I would drop all the way down to play. Jonah Heim, I guess, at 2,300 would be fine. Jorge Alfaro at 2,800 is relatively okay. If Jason Castro's in the lineup, I don't really like the lefty for him, but I'm also not going to be overly scared of hinges against anyone. So there are a few options, but just based the way that pitching is tonight, I don't think you're going to have to punt at catcher. And I think that you can honestly at least get up to someone like Reese McGuire at 3,100. So a lot of different ways that you can go here, but I do really like Yadier. I like Stassi as basically a complete pivot off of him because he's only 200 cheaper. And then if you want to spend up a bit more, Salvador Perez makes a lot of sense. At first base, again, it's repetitive. I feel like you're obviously going to hear a lot of these. It's Paul Goldschmidt. He's too cheap for playing in Coors. He's too cheap for a great matchup. I don't really need to talk your ear off about why Paul Goldschmidt's a good play. I think that Shohei Ohtani is a really good play as well. He's up near 6,000, but he's outfield eligible, so it's not going to be that difficult to get him into your lineups, especially with the pitching if you spend down at both spots. But he's just been on an absolute tear. I have no issues whatsoever if you want to play him tonight. Jared Walsh is another one. I would assume he's going to drop a little bit in the Los Angeles lineup just because it's lefty-lefty. But even after Keegan Aiken gets hit out of the game, which I would expect to be relatively early, he's going to get plenty of innings against Baltimore's bullpen, which is completely fine. Yuli Gurriel, we heard that Yordan Alvarez has been placed on paternity leave, I believe. So he won't be in today. I would assume Gurriel takes over the 4-hole, which makes him a very good option, especially because he's been lacking power and he gets a matchup against someone that has struggled with home runs. Carlos Santana, I do really like. I think that he's a great play tonight. At 5,700, Freddie Freeman probably goes way overlooked, but we kind of talked about it earlier that Pablo Lopez is not even close to the same pitcher on the road as he is at home. So I do think that Freddie Freeman makes sense. And if you want to drop down, Garrett Cooper at 3,200 against Drew Smyly, who in my opinion is a relatively weak left-handed pitcher, is an extremely good play. You also have someone like Max Muncy, if you're looking to spend up as well, who could just hit the home run against Scherzer. And I would assume come in at less than 5% ownership because of his price in the matchup tonight. We can move. Well, I guess I should just add, like, if you want to play CJ Cron, feel free. I just don't think that 4,900 for the 6-hole hitter is worth it unless you're doing some type of stack. I don't know. I won't end up on CJ Cron tonight, but I do think that he's at least reasonable. Second base is, for me, it feels a lot like a spend up or spend down. I do believe that there's some guys in the mid price that I don't really have too many issues with, but The top two options, in my opinion, are going to be Whit Merrifield and Jose Altuve. I believe that you can put Marcus Semien in, I guess, a tier slightly below them. But Merrifield's my number one. Altuve is my number two. I think that they're both very good plays. If you're dropping down, David Fletcher, assuming he's leading off, is way too cheap at 3,200 for the matchup and just the offense that he's playing in tonight. So I 100% believe that David Fletcher is one of the best salary relief options on this slate. I think that Hanser Alberto at 2,700, now that he's hitting fifth, makes a really good play if you're spending down. And then if you're going in the middle, I think that Brendan Rodgers is fine. His price is up, but he's been playing extremely well. I don't necessarily love him. I think that I would rather play Jonathan India, Garrett Hampson. I prefer both of them over Rodgers, but it's just kind of what you prefer. The same can be said for Tommy Edman, who's on the other side hitting sixth. They're fine. I don't hate playing them or anything. Ryan McMahon is pretty pricey for the 7-hole hitter, but the game's going to score a lot. I think that they can all be at least considered. But the way that I would play this personally is if I can get up to Whit Merrifield or Jose Altuve, I would try to do that. If not, I probably drop to Fletcher or Alberto. It's just the mid-tier is probably going to be pretty low owned, so I have no issues whatsoever there. At third base, if you can go all the way up to Nolan Arenado, feel free. Anytime he plays in Coors, especially against a bad pitcher like Gonzalez, I'm not going to tell you no. The problem is he's been pretty cold. I know he still comes with power, and obviously it's in Coors, but 5,800, you're not getting him at any type of discount. Like Goldschmidt's 1,000 cheaper than him and been playing better. So I think he's 100% fine. I just don't think you necessarily have to go there. I do think that Anthony Rendon is a very good option for 1,100 cheaper. If you want to go down even more, 900 below him is Luis Ariz. They're very good plays. Outside of that, though, there's not a ton I love about third base. I think, as always, Abraham Toro is a little too cheap at 3,000. He moved up to sixth in the lineup for Houston. I have no problems whatsoever there. If you want like Joey Wendell at 3,700, I think that's a fine play. That's honestly probably close to it. Rafael Devers, I will never say no to him. I think that he's always in play just because of the upside that he brings. It's just I'm not making him a priority tonight or anything. It just feels a lot like if you can get to Rendon, okay. If not, or if you can get to Arenado, okay. If not, Anthony Rendon or Luis Ariz makes a lot of sense. And then if you have to go down even farther, you probably just drop to Toro at 3,000 because it's just way too cheap. At shortstop, I believe you can play Story. If you can get up to him, feel free. If you want to pivot off of him, I do think that Bo Bichette's fine. I prefer Carlos Correa. Correa is now hitting third. Their lineup just came out a little bit. I have no issues whatsoever with that. As always, Paul DeJong is way too cheap. He's 3,400 in a good matchup. Hitting seventh isn't ideal, but you get a cheap piece of the Coors game, and anytime you can do that, it's always really, really good. Hanser Alberto, also shortstop eligible. Completely fine with him. And then just one more high-priced options, Tim Anderson. Outside of that, I don't think there's too many guys that I really want to play that bad. I guess like Wander Franco, if you want to play, but he's up to 4,600, which is pretty pricey. I'm not really overly interested. I would just find the extra money for Correa because he's one of my favorite plays on the slate. But I do believe that in cash games, this is most likely going to be either Trevor Story or Paul DeJong, just depending if you can spend up or not. In the outfield, I don't want to go over too many people. Colorado and St. Louis, I don't really need to tell you. They have a lot of players that are way too cheap, especially for where they're hitting. Shohei Ohtani, we already talked about. I think that the Cincinnati guys are in good spots, especially Jesse Winker. Miles Straw is hitting eighth, which I didn't necessarily see coming, but, it kind of is what it is. I still think that he's a really good play. Brantley hitting second. I have no issues whatsoever there. I mean, there's just a lot of really, really good plays. Jorge Soler is hitting second. He's only 3,400. Obviously gets the great matchup against J.A. Happ. So a lot of really good plays. I think you have like Larnach at 3,100. It's just too cheap for the matchup against Singer. I don't honestly. Gavin Sheets, as you look, there's just so many options that are way too cheap in the outfield. That's going to make it really easy for roster construction tonight. But that's essentially what I have for you guys. Don't forget that our my content is up at dfskarma.com. Check out our packages. You can get in our Discord for free and always ask questions and everything. But until then, I believe I will be back on Monday with Ben, and good luck tonight.